Today we are in the Stanford University. We're about to interview Michael Snyder. He's an amazing figure in omics and precise medicine. Very exciting.
I'll show you the sequencing center. It's right down here. We measure 135,000 things every time we measure someone. This is where we sequence people's DNA. So the way this works is we'll take your spit and we get DNA from it. We break it into tiny little fragments, load the bits of DNA into here. What they'll do is they'll sequence every one of those bits. Computers will stitch it all together. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is understand how are your bits different from the reference sequence, and do any of those changes put you at high risk for disease? We can tell when people are getting ill from a simple smartwatch. Their resting heart rate jumps up. I first discovered my Lyme disease that way. Here's some of our robotics right here. For anyone who's ever worn one of these things, you'll never eat the same again, and I mean that in a good way. Some of the technology is advancing, so we're getting better at sequencing DNA, faster, more accurately. And so when we do these deep data profiles on people's blood or urine, we can actually see when things are off long before they realize they're getting ill. I think with some re-engineering, we could probably have people live forever.
Hi, welcome to a new episode of the HumanWare project. Today we have here with Michael Snyder. Just a little background introduction from me of who Mike is. When I do the research of omic, I ask GPT, tell me the milestone of omics history. So the first stage obviously is when we first sequenced the human genome, and it's finished in 2003. And then the second milestone, deep data profiling. And when I asked GPT who's the leading scientist for it, your name have shows up. I was like, wow, and we feel really honored to be able to interview you today.
Thanks for having me.
Mike, could you tell us what is omic?
Omics really refers to collecting data around large numbers of things. So, for example, your transcriptome collects data around all your RNA transcripts, which are important molecules. Proteomics collects molecules around all your proteins, collects information around those. And omics itself then is all of these put together. Bottom line is it's doing very, very deep data collection on people, and that's what we set up.
Why this is important, why we need it?
Yeah, well, think about it, backing up a little bit. If you go to a physician's office today, you'll spend, say, 15, 30 minutes there in the US, and they'll measure maybe 15 things, very few things. They'll measure a few blood markers, they'll measure your heart rate, things like that. We measure 135,000 things every time we measure someone. So you get a much, much clearer picture of people's health by doing that.
That's right. I recall when I was younger or little, I go to the doctor office. They always say, oh, how you feel? And after a few minutes, they say, off you go, get some drugs. Many times I don't take the medicine they gave me. That's kind of my bad. But then because deep in my heart, I don't know if I believe what they prescribe is really real. And there's some part of my mind that will be like, maybe my immune system will fight it, right? Mm-hmm. So is omic more data-driven approach for our health?
It is. It lets us get a much clearer picture of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And as an example, when we started our project, which is now about 14 years ago, we started collecting deep data on roughly 109 people. And basically what we discovered is that we could see a much clearer picture. They were thought to be healthy at the time.
Yeah.
And we did discover things either at the time we first profiled them, or we actually profiled them over time, where things would appear. And what we were able to do is discover that things were off in advance of symptoms. And that's one of the problems with medicine today. We often wait till people get sick, and then we try and diagnose them. And sometimes we're not even successful at that. But when we are successful, it's often too late to do a whole lot about it. So what we're trying to do is profile people while they're healthy or thought to be healthy, discover if things look like they're shifting off, and then we can actually take corrective action before they get ill. That's the idea. So the ultimate idea is to keep people healthy for a long, long time. You may or may not know the difference between your health span, how long you're healthy, and how long you live, your lifespan, is 11 to 15 years, depends how you measure it. Meaning people live their last decade of life very unhealthy. And so what we're trying to do is keep people healthy their entire life. And then, pass away after that.
So could I understand that lifespan is how long you can live, and
Right.
health span is how conscious and vital you can live. So your goal is matching those two numbers for people to live a very, very fulfilling, vital life until the day they have to leave this world.
Correct. That's
Yeah.
exactly what we're trying to do.
Think back on all those things we could do to measure our health because our body is incredibly complicated. How do we even start, and what triggers you or inspires you at the beginning to starting all this journey?
Well, for one thing, there's been a revolution in technologies, I'd say, over the last 2 decades. So we can now sequence someone's DNA and then predict their risk for disease. And we spend a lot of time on that, actually. But that's just one part of what's going on. We can now take your blood and your urine and profile literally tens of thousands of molecules out of that. And again, that gives a clearer picture of what's going on. Your blood, you may know, runs throughout your body, through all your organs. And if something goes off, it often leaves signatures. So proteins and other metabolites will show up there that says something's not quite right. And so when we do these deep data profiles on people's blood or urine, we can actually see when things are off long before they realize they're getting ill.
When we studies about your work, there has something shows up called IPOP, and it shows that you are like very man of your words because whenever you doing your science, you actually try it on yourself. And I learned that you find you have precursors for diabetes before any doctor. How you feel when you find that out about yourself?
Sure. Well, after we sequenced my DNA, we made predictions of what diseases I might be at risk for. And the number one thing that appeared was type 2 diabetes. And because we were also collecting other data at the time, the sort I was mentioning, we could track what was going on. And we did pay careful attention to glucose measurements. And sure enough, at one point, suddenly my glucose went way off. It was actually after a nasty viral infection. It's called respiratory syncytial virus. It's a common virus, actually, but I got pretty sick from that. And right after that, my sugar levels went off, and quite severely, in fact, to the point I was classified as diabetic. So what we think is that I was genetically predisposed for diabetes, and then the viral infection actually triggered it. And that's now turned out to be fairly common, meaning 2 to 4% of people who get COVID wind up as diabetic. So it's turned out to be a little more common than people realize. And if you think about it, if you get a viral infection, what does it do to you? Well, most of the time it's fine and clear, but in some cases it can cause problems. In my case, it caused diabetes. In some other people's cases, it causes something called chronic fatigue syndrome for people, or long COVID if it's COVID associated. These viral infections, when they're severe, can sometimes lead to additional complications.
I never thought about in that way because whenever I'm sick or having certain virus, I would be like, it's finished, it's done, my body move on. But what you say is that could trigger other little disease after that infection, even the syndrome seems to going away. And if we don't look into it, that problem could manifest into a bigger problem?
It can. But I think most of the time, don't get me wrong, when you get a viral infection, you clear it, you're fine.
Yeah.
That is the norm. But there are some times when it does lead to these more chronic conditions. When they're severe enough, they can cause complications that people do not anticipate. And I think if you can catch it, you can probably better manage it. But the biggest problem is people go on these long diagnostic odysseys trying to figure out what's wrong with them. And it's not always so easy.
That's exactly how I felt. I'm not come from a medical background, but I do have a desire and curiosity to find out what's going on in me and can I really extend my health span. So when you finding these precursors for diabetes, when you realize the data, when you understand it, is that enough? Can you really do things to change it?
Well, I think in the case of, the genome, we made predictions. It put me on the alert for it so that when my glucose did go off, I could catch it right away. And as I said, I initially got it under control after catching it early, although it did come back later.
Yeah.
So in some cases, you can better manage it. It puts you on the alert. But probably one of the best cases for some of the people we're profiling We caught someone with a BRCA mutation, puts them at high risk for breast cancer. So they'll get screened more frequently to make sure if something goes off, they can actually act on it quickly. There's another person whose genome predicted they're high risk for a heart problem. And sure enough, they had a heart problem, which they didn't realize. And now they're on medication. So in some cases, yeah, you can very much take action that's very, very powerful and can probably save lives.
And thank you for those insightful sharing. I'm just wondering what we could learn from our genome after we sequence it. And also, is that my fate? Can I change it?
Well, I think what it does is it puts you on the alert for what you're at risk for. So if I sequence your genome, and we're still at the early days of this, we can see some obvious things that you might be at high risk for. And one example is BRCA mutations, say that you're high risk for breast or ovarian cancer. So what can you do about that? Well, you'll get screened more so that if you do wind up getting early stage breast cancer or ovarian cancer, you can act on it. Usually you would do surgery. But the problem is if you didn't know you're at risk for it, say you get ovarian cancer, it might grow and get very large. And by the time you discover you have it, it's metastasized, it's moved to other sites, and then it's almost impossible to cure. This is why knowing what you're at risk for is important so that you can actually be on the alert and take action. Now, some people with high risk breast cancer actually take prophylactic surgery, meaning they'll have their breasts removed and ovaries. Angelina Jolie is a good example of that. Her mom died of breast cancer at age 51. And so she knew that there was something in her family. She got tested. Sure enough, she was positive. And so she actually had surgery after she had her kids to be able to basically prevent that from happening.
How much of our health determined by our gene and how much depends on other things?
Great question. So it turns out about 16% of your lifespan depends on your genetics. That means the bulk of it is not genetics. It's
Only
from
16.
lifestyle. Yeah, it's only 16. Although it is the case that for people who live to be 100 or more, 60% depends on their genetics. So to be a long liver, you do need good genes. But nonetheless, for the average person, it's about 16%. And so that means your lifestyle, so your exercise, the food you eat, the exposures you encounter, those can all impact your lifespan.
The gene sequence I'm born with, can that be changed ever, or that's just it? That's the card you'll be dealt. You can never change it.
In today's world, you'd be unlikely to change it. In the future, maybe we will. There are people are at risk for certain severe diseases. Sickle cell is one in the more extreme cases. People are working to modify their DNA and correct those mutations. There are cases like that that people are working on. But it would only be done in the case of severe disease today because we're not that good at it. And you have to worry that if I try and fix a problem, I may create a problem somewhere else. The procedures aren't perfect. So in general, it's pretty unlikely we would try and change your DNA unless you're at high risk for a very severe disease.
When we look at some science fiction, there has a gene programmed babies. Is that possible in all these technologies, or is somewhere in the future?
It's too early. In the future, it will be possible to do all those things. But right now, it's just too early. We're not that good at it. We also don't know the genome well enough in many cases. I mentioned the BRCA case. There's a few others like cystic fibrosis, things like that, where we do know certain mutations will lead to severe disease, and we can fix that. But most diseases, believe it or not, they're what's called complex disease, meaning no single gene mutation causes that problem. And that's true for most forms of diabetes, coronary artery disease, all kinds of problems. It's not one single mutation, so you can't just go in there and fix that. It's thought to be due to hundreds of changes that all have small effects, and if you happen to get a lot of the bad changes, you'll wind up at high risk, and if you have the good changes, they're called invariants, you're at low risk. It's hard to then make hundreds of changes. You're better off actually fixing your lifestyle. So if you're high risk for diabetes, for example, watch your diet. Try and avoid carbohydrates. That'll help a lot, actually. For many people, and especially in today's world, nutrition is a real problem. People tend not to eat very well. They often eat lots of processed foods, high carbs. They get obese, and that's the number one risk factor for all kinds of diseases, including diabetes and coronary artery disease.
Wow, that I'm actually guilty for that. I don't eat as healthy as I wish to be. Can we dive deep into diabetes? Because
Sure.
I think it's such a common disease. I can't help to wonder, first, can we cure it as a society, or if someone really keen to getting better at this? Second of all, if some people have diabetes in their family, can they change their gene destiny in a way to live a life without it?
They're not going to change their genes. Once again, that's too hard to do. But what they can do is change their lifestyle. Now, diabetes wasn't a huge problem, say, 60, 80 years ago. It's only more recently it's become a problem because people eat so much processed food. It's full of carbs. We eat 40,000 times more sugar than we did at the end of World War II, 40,000 times. So it's ridiculous. And so what we need to do is, first of all, cut that out. That's probably number one. And number two, we could not just cut out sugar, but just have a general better lifestyle, period. People now, they're much more overweight than they were, again, 40, 50 years ago. And so we need to have people not just eating better, but exercising more. And I happen to be a big fan of strength training, lifting weights. I do that every day. And the idea is that muscle mass is better for glucose homeostasis, glucose control. I'm a believer that we should be exercising every day. We should be keeping our muscle mass up. It's a really big deal as you get older, because one of the biggest problems as people get old is they lose muscle mass. And once people become immobile, their health just plummets. So as soon as you see someone becoming bedridden, their health just declines very, very rapidly. So it's really important to keep people moving. So when there's an 80-year-old person and somebody says, "Grandpa, take it easy," that's actually bad advice. Hey, Grandpa, get off your chair and walk around more. That's better advice. Another way to look at all this is if you've heard of the blue zones. These are areas in the world, there's a number of them where people live to be 100 or more, a large fraction of the people. And they tend to have three things in common. One is they're very active, meaning they're moving a lot. Second, they tend to avoid ultra-processed foods. They eat better. And the third is that they actually have a good social network. They actually are very tied into their community and their family. And that combination, my own prediction is they probably sleep pretty well too. That's not as well studied, but that would be my guess. All of these things can contribute to, a nice, healthy lifespan.
I do feel that because very luckily both of my great grandma lived to a very old age, and one of them even died in peace, in the sense of she probably know when she's going to pass away, and she put her shoes in place, comb her hair, and then clean herself, and then sleep, and then pass away.
Wow.
It's became one of my goals. Like, okay, can I die in peace like her? Do you think she will find she just have less noise in her gene than others?
Well, the interpretation's still hard, and people like us are working on, using new methods, AI methods, to be able to analyze genomes. So I would say, in general, to your first part, people who do live to be 80 or longer, they generally are lacking a lot of those bad mutations, things that put you at high risk for heart disease and things like that. That's about the only thing we've discovered so far for people who live a long time. There may be other things there that just haven't been picked up yet. It's still early for that. There does seem to be the absence of bad genes for people to live a long time, but it's not an obvious signature just yet for, this person's going to live to be 100 versus not. The best way to live to be 100, first of all, it's probably the only way you can control it, is to live a healthy life. Exercise, as I say, eat better, and do keep your social network up. Most people don't sleep enough either.
When we talk about lifestyle, apart from living a healthier life, like if we want to incorporate some modern technology, what you would recommend, like if it's a wearables?
So another area that we've been pushing very, very hard on is this idea of remote monitoring, and that comes in two forms. One is wearables, these smartwatches, so you can see all my watches,
Tell
my
us
ring,
what you have on you.
even my hearing aid is a sensor. All these things can measure you. They're very powerful because they follow you 24/7. I'm not wearing one right now, but I often wear a continuous glucose monitor. That's another one. On the smartwatches, they're powerful because they measure resting heart rate variability. Those are very important measurements for your health, actually. And it turns out that we can tell when people are getting ill from a simple smartwatch. Their resting heart rate jumps up. And that I first discovered my Lyme disease that way. Meaning when I first got Lyme, the way I found out was that my heart rate jumped up and my blood oxygen dropped. And that was picked up by a smartwatch and something called a pulse ox. Now you can actually measure that on a watch. And these days we can tell if you're getting ill from your smartwatch for any respiratory viral infection. So COVID, we can tell if you're getting COVID before you know it 80% of the time from a smartwatch because your heart rate jumps up. So we think these are really powerful devices for measuring your health.
Yeah.
The number one thing I think is powerful are these continuous glucose monitors. They measure your glucose every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And it turns out that, first of all, diabetes is a huge problem. In the US, 11.9% of people are diabetic and 33% of people are pre-diabetic. So that means almost half of the US population is either pre-diabetic or diabetic, and most of those pre-diabetics will become diabetic. So we need to actually have new measures for catching this. 20% of diabetics don't know it. 90% of pre-diabetics don't know it. So these glucose monitors are powerful because they can see when you're getting glucose dysregulation. For anyone who's ever worn one of these things, you'll never eat the same again. And I mean that in a good way. So if you wear a monitor, you'll see what spikes you. And it turns out different foods spike different people. So some people spike the pasta, some the bread, some the potatoes. We're all different. Our microbiome accounts for only a small part of that, but there are other factors as well that we don't fully understand. So we're spending a lot of time on this now, trying to subdivide diabetes. Diabetes is not one simple disease, and it's not simply type 1 versus type 2. We think there are many forms of diabetes, and we're actually teasing that out now. So it turns out we can tell from a simple glucose monitor whether you're insulin resistant or have a beta cell defect, or maybe have something called an incretin defect. That's a hormone that's important for glucose control. We can actually tell that from a simple shape of the curve. Why is that important? Well, it turns out if you're muscle insulin resistant, you'll spike to potatoes and to pasta. So what you should do then, if you figure out you're muscle insulin resistant, which you can now do from a simple glucose monitor, well, you should avoid potatoes.
Yeah.
So you can actually change your lifestyle and wind up, we think, being healthier.
Last year I was wearing a glucose monitor, and sometimes when you are running late, you have nothing much to eat. If someone gave you an energy bar, you will just have it. I typically don't like sweet stuff as much, but that day I'm really hungry and I have a heartburn, so okay, I'll just have an energy bar. And my glucose beeped so much. Ever since that, I never had another energy bar in my life.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, right? You don't need it, and it's not helping you to have a giant glucose spike, so it sounds like it was full of sugar, your energy bar. There are better things you could eat that wouldn't spike your glucose.
Do share us the story about COVID.
When the pandemic hit, we very quickly launched a study and showed that, in fact, we could detect COVID. A median of 4 days in advance of symptoms, and we set up a real-time alerting system for, and anyone can sign up for that study. It's a real-time alerting system to tell when you're off. And it works about 80% of the time. We can tell when you are getting ill in advance of symptoms, and it's an alerting system. So you click on your phone, you see whether you have a red alert means you're off. And so the story for me was that I woke up one morning and I was getting ready to go to New York City, and I was a little bit congested. So it was this time of year, and you're not sure, this time when there are allergies. Is it allergies? Am I coming down with something? Not sure. So I did an antigen test for COVID. I was negative. My smartwatch said I was positive. But because I wasn't sure, the antigen test said negative, I went ahead and went to New York City. And in order to go to the meeting the next day, you have to get tested. This back when COVID was quite severe. And sure enough, I was bright positive. So I spent a whole week in a tiny little hotel room in New York City, all because I listened to my antigen test and not my smartwatch. Yeah. It turns out, yes, your smartwatch is more sensitive. Now, it also raises another point that the tests we have right now can't distinguish different things. It's not perfectly specific. We know you're off on something. Turns out actually workplace stress is the number one trigger of red alerts. It's a mental
Workplace
health.
stress.
Yeah. It's a mental health monitor as well.
Oh.
Now, I know if we bring in different data types, that's why we want people in our study, we'll be able to tell the difference between workplace stress and a COVID infection because your respiration will be very, very different in those two scenarios. So I'm quite confident we can distinguish those, but we need the data to prove that and train our algorithms. The bottom line is these devices, they will be powerful for just what I said, for detecting when you're first getting ill, whether it's physically or mentally. I think you can pick that up with the smartwatch.
How I feel about that is almost like as an entrepreneur, if there has an important meeting, is almost we wishful thinking. We wish we are fine, so I just do it to believe in the better data in favor of our decisions. But then I think the truth of data is if you can just think for another second, you are like, if I don't go to all the trouble to go to that meeting, maybe I can do it online and then later I can stay at my home. It will make you actually more efficient rather than less efficient than going to the meeting.
That's the idea of all these measurements. It's really to be able to get a much, much clearer picture of your health and then, act accordingly. If things are going off, then you should take action.
For the people who don't know so much about the application part of this, could you first of all show us how many watches you got, why you have so many different watches? Are they all do different things?
We're still always evaluating these things, but they all measure heart rate variability, and that's important. But some of them will measure blood pressure, some of them don't. Some of them measure skin temperature, and there are varying degrees of accuracy and resolution.
Okay.
So some of them are very high resolution, so they're measuring your heartbeat at very high frequency. Others are at very low resolution. And so we're trying to optimize this, figure out what is the best measurements to do and at what frequency, because you can measure everything at very high resolution, but the battery will drain very, very fast. So we're trying to find the sweet spot, if you will, for what's important for health monitoring.
Because maybe not all of us have the privilege to access to the lab to really understand it. So let's say the matrix of all those data we see on our apps, what does heart rate variability tell me about me, and what should I looking to in a day cycle, and if I work out, what is a good measurement?
Heart rate variability is the difference between your heart beats. And you might think that heart rate variability, high variability, is bad for you, but it's the opposite. It's good for you. And it has to do with the fact that you have a nervous system that will basically fire signals, and you actually should have a slightly irregular heartbeat. So when you get ill, it turns out, you actually get low heart rate variability. That's not good, but it's a great measure. It's only being appreciated fairly recently in the last several years. Heart rate variability is a really good health measure. If you see your heart rate variabilities dropping very low, something may be off.
Okay. And if I work out, should I expect it to get higher or lower? Is that related to workout or is that related to other things?
Well, the workout will mostly affect your resting heart rate. What you want to do is get your heart rate up very, very high if you can to exercise your cardiovascular system. That varies a lot with age, meaning when you're young, you can get your heart rate up to 180. That's a lot harder to do when you're 70. A lot of people say for intensive training, you want to get your heart rate up to about 80% of its maximum.
If I have insight for the data, what would be an ideal world as a lifestyle my heart rate should look like in a day?
Well, I'd say to optimize your sleep, I'd probably work on other things. One is don't eat for 3 hours before you sleep, because people who eat or drink right before they sleep, they tend to have a restless sleep. We found that people who take a walk after dinner, they have lower glucose the next day, so I think that's very useful. There's a lot of other tricks people will tell you, don't have any light at night, especially blue light will reset your circadian system. That's not good. People say the optimal temperature is 64 degrees in the room for you to have your best sleep. Now, I'm sure that varies a little bit from person to person, but those are some very easy tricks.
And currently, what are your heart rate variability devices that you use to measure yourself? You think is most convenience?
I have a Fitbit, an Apple Watch, and this is my company, Omics. I have 2 watches I'm testing now. So they measure just what I said before, heart rate variability, blood oxygen. They can measure, the Sensomics one will measure blood pressure. They can also measure something called galvanic stress response, which is really, it's conductance on your skin. Why is that important? We don't measure that in a doctor's office, but it turns out it's kind of valuable because if you're diabetic, your skin gets drier.
Oh.
And actually, yeah. So, and you can pick, you don't have to worry unless you have dry skin, I guess. But yeah, you can pick that up with a smartwatch. So,
can you say that words again? Because I actually didn't heard about that.
Yeah, galvanic stress response. It's a fancy way of saying skin conductance, so electrical signal. What we've been able to do too is using machine learning and AI, make predictions of a lot of clinical features from things you measure on a smartwatch. And as an example, so your smartwatch, when it measures blood oxygen, it's shining light into your blood vessels and can see whether your hemoglobin, your molecule carrying oxygen, is carrying oxygen, how much. That's how you measure SpO2. Yeah. And so it uses something called spectroscopy to pick that up. But it turns out then it can also measure exactly how much hemoglobin and blood you have, if you will, as well. And that's useful for anemia, for example. If you're low on blood cells, you can become anemic. So your watch can actually pick that up too. So you can get a lot of health information just from a simple smartwatch.
Skin is a very important organ in Chinese medical way.
Yeah.
When you talk about skin temperature measurement, what that can tell us?
Skin temperature, it's kind of a proxy for your core body temperature. Your body temperature is a means of telling if you're ill or not. I don't think it's a very good one compared to heart rate. Heart rate's much, much better.
Another area you're very famous for is for the gut health. Could you tell us a little bit about our gut health?
I am a believer that you are what you eat. Food is medicine. And so I think we don't take good care of ourselves generally, and I was guilty of that. We all can improve, of course, but I don't eat any ultra-processed foods. I cut that out once I became diabetic. One area that's really missing a lot is fiber in people's diet. So we eat much, much less fiber than we used to many years ago. Now, fiber is a source of carbohydrate, but it's in a long chain, so it doesn't just stream right into your bloodstream. So a little science here, your food enters your stomach, then into your small intestine, and the small molecules just pour right into your blood like sugar. That's how little kids get a big energy boost, because the sugar goes right in there. Your large intestine is a fermentation chamber. And so fiber is really critical because it helps with both your stomach and something called gastric emptying and small intestine, but it's especially important for your large intestine because there you break down fiber and slowly release important things like polyphenols, all these very important molecules. And it turns out your microbiome, everybody knows your microbiome is super important for your health. We have more microbial cells in our gut than the rest of our human body. We have 37 trillion cells in a human and 1.6 times as many of that for bacteria. So we're mostly bacteria, a little less human.
Wow.
But anyway, back to the fiber. So fiber feeds that bacteria that's in your gut. And that's very, very important because if you don't do that, the bacteria actually chews away at your intestinal wall and makes a leaky gut. So then that means things in your colon, if you will, can actually get into your bloodstream, and that's not good. So you want to keep your microbes in your gut very healthy and happy, and the way you do that is by having plenty of fiber. Now, not all fibers are the same. This is an area we're researching, trying to figure out, because some are long chain, they call them, some are short chain, some are hydrophobic, meaning greasy, some are hydrophilic, so water soluble, some are positive, some are negative charged. They're very, very different. It's like calling all animals the same. Well, humans and a cockroach are pretty different, we like to think. So we think these fibers are pretty different. So we're testing different fibers now to see what they do on your health. And we know that some of them, for example, there's one called arabinoxylan. It's a pretty common one. That actually improves your cholesterol, we've discovered. And we've figured out how it does that as well.
Let's say if I do have a gut issue, or some people have a inflammatory in their gut or leaky gut, what they can do proactively towards it?
Number one thing would be eat more fiber. Yeah, so start building up the fiber in your colon so you can keep your microbes healthy. They won't chew at your gut wall as much. So I would say that's number one.
And is there any test I can do? Like, let's say if I do a test and then change my diet and then test again, what will be the test?
Great question. So I don't think there's the perfect test for that. One of the things that we've set up fairly recently is something called microsampling, where you can take little drops of blood at home, you mail it in, and we'll profile 600 metabolites off you. And those metabolites will tell you things like your oxidative stress, your inflammation, all kinds of things you can measure from this. That information is very actionable. In fact, these days, we have a company that does this called Iolo. They use AI to take the information about you that you put in, as well as information that's out there, make very specific recommendation. So these markers are off. You should eat more of this and less of that. They even sometimes recommend things I've never heard of. The point out of all this is that I think we can better measure your health and do it at home, which is nice, and then take correctable action to actually improve your health.
How I really love, our interviews, to make a little side note, is when let's say last time when we interviewed Dr. Lee Hood, he has mentioned how difficult to convince the people to do that, or even to convince the government to start this huge project to sequence all the human genome and all to pairing it up and all of that. And then today we have you here, like we talk about this systematic way to profiling our gene data. I really appreciate those early pioneers to make all those things happen, because I imagine after few years or so, this will become everyday normal, but there are people who are figure those puzzle out.
The key is to put it in terms that people can use and understand. And a good example is, I think early on, a lot of scientists were just putting out things like data clouds and stuff. And what the heck do you do with that? Nobody knows what to do with that. But at the end of the day, like your car, if you can distill things into very simple information that people understand, like a speedometer. If you're going too fast, well, slow down. Very, very, very simple. But if I were to throw up all the numbers about wheels, running per minute, this kind of thing, what the heck do you do with that? You wouldn't know. But you know what to do when the speed is too high. So I think what we need to do is take all this information, which is what some of my companies do. They do measure lots and lots of things, but then they distill it in a pretty simple form that you can understand and act on. And I think some of the stuff is very, very powerful. Continuous glucose monitors being a good example. If you see what food spikes you, you'll never eat the same, because you'll avoid those. And these days they'll have AI recommendation programs. So we have a company for that called January AI. They have recommendation programs. Well, if this food spikes you, eat that one instead. And so I think we really can eat a lot better. And I think what's powerful about these new technologies, a lot of it's very visual. And so you really can modify your behavior based on just seeing what's going on. And we could never do that before.
I feel like we live in such a beautiful and abundant world. I feel living in the best time in the history of human. But then here comes the problem with so much goods in the shop, and you need to know what to shop and what you need. So it's absolutely our passion as a channel to grow with our audience together, to navigate through the healthcare system, and then to be proactive towards our own health, and maybe collaborate with the people who can give a simplified or very straightforward information of what we can do.
I would say it's how you get the information back to people. I can imagine waking up in the morning and having a little recommendation. Well, you didn't sleep so well, and but you ate these following things before bed. Avoid that tonight. So you can actually do little simple things that will make your life a lot better and your health a lot better. So I think we can incorporate this information. The key is to keep it convenient and bring the information into a fashion that people can understand. It's early days, and that's why a lot of the stuff is really quite complicated. But I think as we get better at executing this, hopefully we will get people to live long, healthy lives.
What are the current fun projects you are working on?
We touched on a lot of these. We do this deep data profiling. So we're doing a lot with these microsampling I mentioned, where you take little drops of blood, mail it in, and we can now measure 7,000 molecules off those drops of blood. So that's very powerful for health monitoring, we think, and gives a much, much clearer picture. So anybody can do it, and it's not that expensive. The goal ultimately will get it even cheaper. So I think we could then have people measure themselves much, much more often while they're healthy, rather than waiting until they get ill. So a lot of this stuff is becoming very, very accessible.
And when you mention age, what do you think is age? And you have in one lecture mentions about agiotype. Could you tell us what it is?
Yeah, so what we discover, because we profile people longitudinally, we can see how they change. And it turns out everyone changes differently, meaning their biochemical pathways that are shifting are different from one person to the next. So we saw one person was more of a cardioager. That was their top biochemical pathway that was changing. Another person, like me, I'm an immune and metabolic ager. That's pretty typical. Luckily, my immune aging is rather slow. I like that because your immune system's super important. Anyway, we discovered that everybody ages differently. We call this agiotype, and it's actionable information. So depending what agiotype you are, determines what course of action you might take.
Oh, that's beautiful insight. And the one last question, to be such a well-established scientist and everything you do and as your work, why do you think you are driving for make this happen?
Well, I just think the way we do health monitoring today is totally broken, and I really want to change it. I think we should be shifting, and I think there's an interest, at least among some people, to do this, to shift to keeping people healthy, follow them while they're healthy so that they don't get ill. And I think that's the driver for me. And just thinking on first principles, the way we practice healthcare, it's pretty archaic. It's pretty Byzantine. We really should be profiling people while they're healthy. That's what the wearables are good at. That's what the microsampling's good at, so that you can actually keep people healthy. And, I think the consequences should be amazing, right? We should really be able to have people live long, healthy lives. I really do believe that. I also believe not everyone does, but I believe you should also be able to engineer people so they live forever.
Right.
What we mostly do is work on health span, catch disease early, try to keep people healthy, and I think that's important. But I think with some re-engineering, we could probably have people live forever. That's a little bit trickier because, for example, your mitochondria pick up mutations and things. So how are you going to do that? Well, just eating better is not going to fix that. You actually have to do mitochondrial transfers, which is doable, by the way. I think with some re-engineering, we may need to replace our stem cells, that sort of thing in the future. We probably can have people live forever.
Yeah, thank you. Spot on our belief as a channel. Our channel called the Human Wear Project. So you have software and hardware and human wear. And I believe as a piece of human wear, you can be better at yourself, utilize software and hardware. Yeah. Thank you for your time today, Mike. Really insightful conversation. Can't wait to have a look around of your lab.
Sure. Great to be here.
Thank you for watching this new episode of the Human Wear Project. It will help us a lot to subscribe and like this video. Looking forward to see you soon.